So Blood Angels and Space Wolves are quite clearly strongest in melee. Today we'll be discussing whether a strong list from this faction should take any guns alongside their melee threat. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. So Blood Angels and Space Wolves, as we know, are very dangerous when they get into close combat. Whether that's the Blood Angels with their +1 to wound, boosted charges, and very scary number of attacks from fighty characters and Death Company, or the Space Wolves ripping into you with their +1 to hit and dangerous things like Thunderwolf Cavalry and Wolfen. The two factions kind of have an issue that because all of their buffs are geared towards melee, it feels very underwhelming to invest any sort of points to the shooting aspect of the armies rather than just charge headlong in, thunderhammers swinging and chainswords humming. So let's get straight into it. First of all, I will say that it is tempting to go all in melee, and it's certainly a strategy that you can go with. Compared with other chapters, any points invested in the equivalent units, whether that's Space Marine Eliminators or Thunderfire Cannons, or Repulsor Executioners for example, will generally give you a bit less of a return than if you'd used it in an army that had chapter tactics that benefited shooting. It's very hard psychologically to take a unit where you know it's flatly inferior to the same unit when it's being employed by another Space Marine chapter. Melee armies also quite wanting to reach a critical mass in terms of the amount of threats that they can throw at the enemy. You do have the chance of winning big or losing big with melee. Say if you just took 2 units that were charging headlong at the enemy, there's a good chance the enemy might be able to kill 2 units before they get there. But perhaps if you'd taken 5 such units and not bothered investing the points in guns, then perhaps the opponent might still have only been able to kill 2 of them and the other 3 make it to enemy lines. Taking away points that could be invested in another very scary melee threat is certainly quite a big opportunity cost when you're trying to overwhelm your opponent with threats. Basically you need any investment in firepower to yield an overall positive return for your army that helps out the major close combat element. I think that there are definitely ways that this can be achieved though in Space Wolves and Blood Angels. One of the most obvious ones is clearing chaff screening units so your melee units aren't impeded from charging into the heart of the enemy army and hopefully destroying it. It's a lot more sad if a unit of Death Company just has to absolutely pulverise 10 guardsmen rather than taking out a Lehman Russ or 2. So if you invest in a fair amount of anti-infantry firepower, you might be able to get those guardsmen dead before the Death Company charge in, meaning that they can deep strike closer to the heart of the enemy army and deal more damage to more important things. Another issue is that you might just have a couple of units in your opponent's army that would massively help your battle plan if you were able to take them out early. Say if you're using a lot of Terminators with either Blood Angels or Space Wolves, and your opponent has only got 1 unit that's really good at high AP shooting. Say they have a unit of Grav Centurions, having enough firepower to just delete that unit, or at least kill a fair bit of it, could really help out your melee forces, because you've taken out the single greatest threat to them. The same is sort of apparent of more Horde type armies, say if you were playing Horde melee Orcs. If you had just enough shooting to take out one pesky Lehman Russ Punisher that would otherwise be removing 20 plus boys from the field each turn, and your army is going to be at a significant advantage. Thirdly, a bit of shooting can also help with destroying threats that are too far away for your melee units to efficiently reach. Perhaps your opponent's been crafty and deployed a unit of Devastators right at the top of a ruin. If you're playing a ground-based assault force, something like Space Wolves Wolfen, they might need to charge up several floors to be able to get to them, and they might not even be able to reach them at all if they're blocked off all places for the Wolfen to position themselves on that top floor. It's kind of similar with far-flung medium sort of threat units that might be hugging the edge of a board or on a far-flung objective. It's often not going to be worth taking one of your incredibly fighting melee units all the way over to finish off an Imperial Guard unit that's claiming an objective a while away. It'd be better to have them getting stuck into the heart of the army and making the most of their damage potential, and maybe just have just enough anti-infantry shooting to gun down that unit, so the threat is dealt with and the objective is left unsecured, rather than having to divert the movement of your more pricey units. Now it's true that Blood Angels and Space Wolves don't really have many shooting benefits over other chapters, but they do enjoy a few, the Space Wolves in particular. Space Wolf Longfangs are an interesting variant on the Devastator squad. They get some innate reroll 1s, and they've got really quite a good unique stratagem in the Wolf's Eye, which allows them to reroll wound rolls against a target. They also have access to Keen Senses for 1 command point to allow them to ignore modifiers to hit, which can actually be really powerful when you're shooting at something like an Eldar Flyer, which might have many stacking negatives to hit. They have Chooser of the Slain, a pretty handy intercept type stratagem where a unit that's stood next to a Rune Priest can automatically fire on an incoming enemy unit provided they can see them, which I'd argue is stronger than Auspex Scan because its range isn't limited, but at the same time it would mean that you'd have to have a Rune Priest on the board in the right position. so there's certainly pros and cons. Finally, they have a half-decent gunship in the Stormfang, which used to be very overcosted, but I think it's got a sort of role at the moment from the Stormstrike stratagem that it can pull off with its Hellfrost Destructor. Being able to auto-explode now or shoot when it dies does at least give you a half-decent gun platform. Blood Angels, on the other hand, are a bit of a different story. They get almost no shooting buffs throughout the whole codex. They only really have one unique dedicated shooting unit, and that's the Bile Predator, which unfortunately is not in a good place right now. You're generally going to be better off taking Assault Cannon Razorbacks. And they have the Explosive Judgment strat for their Sanguinary Guard, who are still very much a dedicated melee unit, but I guess that it's something. On the downside, neither of them get access to any Centurions, either Assault or Devastator variants, which is a shame as both of them are pretty strong shooters. As we said, Space Wolves had no Auspex scan, and neither of them get access to the Chapter Master stratagem, due to them having their own unique Chapter Masters in Logan, Grimnar and Dante, though sadly neither of them have the updated wording which allows them to reroll any hit rolls, not just failed ones, so modifiers do monkey with their rerolls. Due to this relative sparsity of shooting buffs, really your best bet if you want shooting platforms in Codex is just to go something that on a unit per unit basis is just generically strong. At the moment, some of the strongest marine shooting platforms here are things like a Quad-Las Contemptor Dreadnought, who's the Mortis version from Forge World. There aren't very many Space Marine anti-tank platforms more efficient than him. Eliminators with bolt sniper rifles have pretty excellent damage output no matter what they're firing at, whether it's a character or a battle tank. They're just very undercosted to be honest, and could easily be justified in Blood Angels or Space Wolves. Whirlwinds are fairly efficient, ignores line of sight shooting, and of course they don't get access to the Thunderfire cannons unfortunately, meaning that Whirlwinds are pretty much your go-to ignores line of sight. Repulsor Executioners are fairly convincing, particularly as they can outrange other foes, and provide a slew of anti-infantry shots should the enemy try and close with them. And Aggressors are really quite a good bet for either chapter, as well as having very good shooting from an anti-infantry point of view. They of course make very good use of the Space Wolves and Blood Angels melee damage output, so just all round strong as they can be efficient in both phases. Space Wolves also have some decent synergy with them, being able to outflank them, and are certainly a decent option to consider compared with something like Wolfen. Finally, the Leviathan Dreadnought has some excellent damage output, and when paired with these two armies you can really convince people to try and stay away from the midfield, so hopefully your Leviathans should have a little bit less chance of getting locked up in close combat, or if you do then you can brutally counterpunch them straight back. I think in reality most of the time you are going to be better off allying in firepower if you want to get the biggest bang for your buck, though obviously a lot of people like to play pure one army, and that's absolutely fine too, but I do think it might be a little bit weaker if you are including shooting units. Of course there are trade-offs to doing this, the main one being the loss of their own unique doctrine, the Savage Fury for the Space Wolves which will get them additional hits, and the Savage Echoes of the Blood Angels, which gets them additional attacks when they're in the Assault Doctrine. Despite losing these fairly decent melee buffs, I think a lot of people are quite happy to give them up, just because often by turn 3 the game is very much going one way or another. It's often better to have some less powerful rules for the first couple of turns, rather than get all of your goodies on turn 3, where you might already have won or lost. In general, combat doctrines are just a little bit weaker now, whether you're playing Devastator or Tactical, and the Assault one has always been one that takes a long time to get to, and it's been an issue since they first came in. I think that allying with another Space Marine shooting chapter is now more viable than ever. Some likely contenders for what you might want to ally in if you do want to go this route could be something like a Master Artisans and Stealthy Successor chapter, who are a very tried and tested combo just for getting raw more damage output and more defense out of the units that you've taken. Say if you went for a Repulsor Executioner for example, a Blood Angels or Space Wolves one wouldn't get any bonuses from their chapter traits, but if you allied it into a Space Marine chapter with a Master Artisans and Stealthy combo, it will both get rerolls to hit and to wound each time it shoots, and unless your opponent has ignores cover when they're firing from away, it's going to be getting a very nice 2+ save, which will certainly save you some incoming damage. The same is very true of things like Eliminators, or the Contemptors, or perhaps even Whirlwinds, should you want to go that route. Another common plug-and-play type detachment is the Imperial Fist Thunderfire Squadron that seems to be cropping up in quite a lot of competitive marine lists these days. These guys are basically a spearhead of Imperial Fist Thunderfires, which you can't get in either Space Wolves or Blood Angels, so a pretty reasonable one to ally in, as an incredibly strong marine shooting unit. Typically what I've seen people do is to take a Imperial Fist Captain, give them the Eye of Hypnoth, and that combo will allow you to reroll all hit and wound rolls of 1 for the Imperial Fists within 6 inches of him, and then because of their chapter trait, the Thunderfires will also be ignoring cover. This just makes for some furiously accurate firepower that's perfect for dislodging entrenched troops from objectives across the board, and you can use it as a bit of a point and delete array, to clear screens, or just put some extra damage on key units as you should see fit. It's a really strong addition to something like Space Wolves or Blood Angels. I think that now that Deathwatch have got their Psychic Awakening update, which has just basically given them combat doctrines and little else, these guys will start to make a bit of a return as a decent allied force to provide some absolutely murderous anti-infantry firepower. The playstyle of Deathwatch synergizes quite nicely with Blood Angels and Space Wolves. They have nifty tricks for getting around and deep striking. You could use things like drop pods or the Beacon Angelis to throw a couple of really powerful kill teams up turn 1 and potentially remove all of the chaff that your opponent has, allowing you to hopefully make some big charges on turn 2 and get your combat units right to the heart of the enemy. They won't really help you much with anti-tank firepower, but you could definitely have these guys take care of the infantry while your melee troops go in to crack the tanks and hard targets. Finally, you could bring in some Deep Strike from the main Marine Codex, things like Deep Strike Centurions from the Raven Guard Stratagem, where you could have a whole ton of Grav Centurions turn up and use the Stratagem to melt everything to death, or the tried and tested Grav Devastator drop pod, again jumping in using the Stratagem to destroy a hard target right from turn 1. The Grav Devastators are pretty much a point and delete unit that can just drop in and nuke an enemy threat before it even gets going. You could even think about going outside Codex, though of course you would lose combat doctrines, which is a major downside, but Imperial Guard can be used to get some very cheap command points to soup up some Space Wolves or Blood Angels characters for some mad stratagem use. And if you are happening to use some for their very cheap command points, then there's no reason that you couldn't get a little bit of shooting from them. In particular, Guard Artillery is very useful, and Leman Russ Demolishers or tank commanders with things like the Hammer of Sunderance can be incredibly powerful shooting assets to have in your army, doubly so if you chose to make them tank aces or something. So overall, I think that there are very strong allies and options to be had for Space Wolves and Blood Angels shooting. It does make the list a little bit more nuanced to play, using a little bit of shooting with a mainly close combat list. It'll make it a bit less of just a headlong charge at the enemy lines, and actually having to put a bit of thought into using a few ranged units to get the most out of them and help your main battle line. But it can give you some really good answers to some problems that your opponent can cause you. Anything from screening or far-flung threats, or just deleting one very important fragile unit early. I generally think that you will get more out of allies than remaining in Codex if you're looking to 100% optimize your list, but there's plenty of decent options that you can use in Codex, and just because other chapters can do things a little bit better doesn't mean that any given unit is necessarily a bad option if you are choosing to play mono Space Wolves or mono Blood Angels. Out of the two, I think that Blood Angels might find it a bit easier to go in with absolutely no shooting output whatsoever, just because of their high mobility, meaning that they can get all right over the board really quickly with stratagems, or even their jump pack units on the board are still pretty darn fast. I feel like in general Space Wolves at a more competitive level might profit just a little bit more. So let me know your thoughts and opinions on the shooting options for these chapters down in the comments below. If you play an assault based army, do you feel the need to include a small amount of shooting, or do you just go all in on melee? If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for plenty of similar 40k content coming out very regularly. And if you'd like to help support the channel, I'd just like to mention my Element Games affiliate link, which is down in the description below. It'll give you anywhere between 10 and 20% off 40k models in the UK. I've now included an Amazon link as well for people in the USA if they want to buy miniatures to support the channel. Basically, if you were thinking about buying some models anyway, then if you ordered through one of these sites, giving that link a click first, a small amount of the profits goes to Auspex Tactics without costing you any more at all. It really has been helping the channel out quite a lot and allowing me to justify making all of these videos, so a big thank you to those of you who have been clicking those links when you've been buying things. It is very much appreciated. In any case, thank you very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.